What if the most important target in a war isn't a weapon at all, but a road? Tonight, we're looking at why Iran's bridges just became the center of this entire conflict, and why that single shift might matter more than any missile fired so far. Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand what's happening in this war, instead of just scrolling past confusing headlines, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one, and it genuinely helps us know who we're talking to. Now, let's get into what actually happened. For 5 straight nights, there was a pattern to this war. Radar stations went down first, then missile batteries, then coastal defense sites, then patrol boats, then command centers. Anyone watching closely could see the logic. Take out the eyes and ears of a military before you touch anything else. It's a textbook approach, and it played out almost exactly the same way, night after night, like clockwork. Then came the 6th night, and everything changed. This time, the target list didn't include a single radar station or missile launcher. Instead, it was bridges. Highway bridges, railway bridges. The actual physical roads and train lines that connect the southern coast of Iran to everywhere else in the country. On paper, that might sound like a smaller story than a missile battery getting destroyed. It isn't. It might actually be the biggest shift in this entire war so far, and here's why. Bandar Abbas sits on Iran's southern coast, right along the Strait of Hormuz. It is one of the most important ports in the entire country. Fuel, weapons, and military equipment bound for Iran's forces, and for groups Iran backs across the region, regularly move through this exact corridor before heading north or out toward other destinations. Now, picture what happens when you start cutting the roads leading out of that port. Supply lines don't stop instantly, they slow down. And if enough roads disappear, eventually they don't move at all. That is exactly what happened this week. Strikes hit a bridge on the route connecting Bandar Abbas to Kamarej. 2 more bridges came down along a separate road running through Kohestak. More were destroyed near Latan Koshar and a small village called Mararud. And the control tower at the port of Chabahar, a target that had already been hit twice before in this war, was struck again. This time, reports say it was completely destroyed. Think about that for a second. Not 1 tower strike, not 2, 3. Someone clearly wants Chabahar out of the picture entirely, and there's a reason for that. Chabahar isn't just another port. It's Iran's only major port that sits outside the Strait of Hormuz completely, along the Gulf of Oman instead. For years, Iran has quietly built it up as a backup plan, a way to keep trade moving even if the strait itself becomes too dangerous to use. Every time that tower gets hit, that backup plan gets weaker. None of this required troops on the ground. Nobody planted mines in the water. No soldiers crossed a border. A combination of fighter jets, drones, and naval air power did the entire job from the sky. Military analysts have a name for this kind of operation. They call it a logistics siege. Instead of confronting an army head-on, you attack its ability to move at all. No fuel reaching the front lines, no replacement weapons arriving, no easy way to resupply anything. It's slower than a direct battle, but in some ways, it's more effective because there's no dramatic moment for the other side to rally around. It's just a slow, quiet tightening, night after night. While all of this was happening on land, something equally dramatic was unfolding out at sea. According to statements from U.S. Central Command, Iran launched a massive wave of missiles, reportedly around 111 of them, toward a U.S. carrier strike group operating in the Persian Gulf. That strike group is built around the USS Abraham Lincoln, one of the most heavily defended vessels in the entire American fleet. Every single one of those missiles was intercepted. Not most of them. Not the majority. All of them. In a war that has been escalating night after night, that number stopped a lot of people in their tracks. It tells you something very specific about how much defensive capability the carrier group has built into its systems, layer after layer of radar, tracking, and interceptors, all working together in real time to stop an attack of that size before a single missile could land. On top of that, officials confirmed something else worth sitting with. More than 50,000 American service members remain stationed across the Middle East right now. That's not a small number, and it's not one that gets mentioned by accident. It's the kind of figure that gets noticed by military planners, by foreign governments, and by anyone trying to guess what happens next. Is it a warning? Is it preparation? Officials haven't said it directly, but a number that large speaks for itself. Put all of these pieces together, and a much clearer picture starts to form. This isn't a conflict limited to scattered military strikes anymore. It has grown into something bigger, an effort to physically cut off one region of Iran from another, an effort to choke supply routes before they can even be used, and a very public demonstration that attacks on American naval assets are not going to succeed, no matter how large the wave. For Iran, the impact of all this is already showing. Roads that used to carry weapons and fuel without any trouble are now blocked or completely destroyed. Ports that used to run without interruption are now damaged, in some cases more than once. And a missile barrage meant to send a powerful message ended with every single missile falling short of its target. That's not the outcome anyone launching 111 missiles was hoping for. So the real question isn't whether this pressure is working. The early signs already answer that. The real question is what Iran decides to do next, and whether that next move pushes this conflict past a point where it can still be pulled back. Let's shift out to the water now, because a second kind of pressure has been building there too, and it's just as important as anything happening on land. On Tuesday, U.S. Central Command reinstated a full naval blockade around Iran's ports. This wasn't a brand new idea, it had been used earlier in this conflict before, but bringing it back in the middle of 6 straight nights of airstrikes sent a very clear signal. The pressure campaign wasn't going to stop at bridges and bases, it was heading straight for the water too. Then on Wednesday, something happened that turned that policy into a headline. A massive oil tanker flagged out of a small nation and identified as a very large crude carrier began moving toward Karg Island. If you're not familiar with why that matters, Karg Island is not just another stop along the coast. It is Iran's primary terminal for exporting oil. Nearly everything Iran sells to the rest of the world passes through that single point. It's the financial heartbeat of the entire country's export economy. That ship received multiple warnings. It kept moving anyway. What happened next was fast, and it was direct. A U.S. aircraft launched Hellfire missiles into the vessel's smokestack, disabling it before it could reach its destination. No injuries were reported. The goal here wasn't to sink the ship or hurt anyone on board. The goal was disruption, and more importantly, a message. And that message wasn't really meant for one single crew. It was meant for every captain running similar routes under similar flags, quietly moving oil that sanctions were designed to stop in the first place. There's a term for these vessels. People call it the shadow fleet. Ships using flags of convenience and evasive routing specifically to slip past restrictions unnoticed. Every one of those captains just watched in real time exactly what happens when a warning gets ignored. For anyone who follows maritime law or energy security closely, this incident became an instant case study. It proved something important. The blockade wasn't just words on paper, it had real teeth behind it. Take a moment to really sit with everything so far, because we're only halfway through tonight's picture and it gets even more complicated from here. If this kind of clear, no-noise breakdown is helping you actually follow this war instead of getting lost in it, do us a favor and tap that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it tells us to keep making more of these. Back on land, the full scale of the previous night's bridge strikes was becoming clearer by the hour. 6 highway and railway bridges gone. Multiple supply routes cut. A port control tower destroyed for a third time. All of it aimed at one single outcome, stopping the movement of weapons and fuel between the coast and the interior in both directions. What makes this particular approach so different from earlier phases of the war is what it doesn't require. No mines placed in shipping lanes, no soldiers crossing into Iranian territory. Instead, a combination of airstrikes and precision weapons did something quieter, but arguably far more effective. They made movement itself the target, not a base, not a weapon. Movement. Military analysts keep coming back to that same phrase, a logistics siege. Instead of confronting an opposing force head-on, you slowly take away its ability to feed itself. No fuel arriving where it needs to, no ammunition being replaced, no supply trucks making it through. Over time, even a heavily armed force starts running on empty, not because it lost a battle, but because it simply couldn't move anymore. Officials have also kept pointing back to the scale of American forces supporting this entire effort. More than 50,000 troops positioned across the Middle East, described by Central Command as ready and prepared to act. Numbers like that, repeated publicly and consistently, carry weight far beyond any single battlefield. It's a message to regional governments, to allied forces, and to Iran's own leadership that this posture isn't temporary. It's not going anywhere soon. For Iran, the combination of a tightening naval blockade and a disabled tanker creates a very specific kind of problem, and it's one that goes straight to the heart of the country's finances. Oil exports fund a huge share of the government's operations. When a ship carrying that oil gets hit before it even leaves regional waters, it doesn't just cost money in that one moment. It sends a warning to every other vessel considering the same route. Some analysts believe this could push shipping companies and tanker operators to quietly stop using Iranian routes altogether, rather than risk their ships and their crews over it. If that happens on a wide scale, the damage to Iran's economy could end up being bigger than any single missile strike could ever cause. At the same time, all of this raises the stakes for whatever comes next. A disabled tanker and a string of destroyed bridges aren't small, symbolic moves. They represent a direct challenge to how Iran moves both its money and its military resources. And that leads to the heaviest question hanging over this entire conflict right now. How much pressure is Iran willing to absorb before it responds in a way that changes the entire shape of this war? That answer came sooner than a lot of people expected, and it pushed this conflict into territory it hadn't touched before. Because every siege eventually forces some kind of response. And Iran's response, when it finally came, was different from anything we'd seen up to this point. Missiles were launched toward Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Qatar, all in a short window of time. On the surface, this looked like a continuation of the same pattern the war had followed for weeks. But one single detail set this moment apart from everything that came before it. In Kuwait, a strike damaged a power and water desalination plant. Read that again, because it matters more than it might sound at first. This wasn't a military base. It wasn't a radar site or a naval vessel sitting in open water. It was civilian infrastructure. The exact kind of facility that keeps clean drinking water flowing to ordinary homes, hospitals, and businesses that have absolutely nothing to do with this war. For analysts who've been tracking this conflict closely, this single strike marked a real turning point. Up until now, both sides had mostly kept their targeting focused on military assets, ports, bridges, patrol boats, missile batteries, infrastructure tied directly to fighting capacity. A desalination plant breaks that pattern completely. And once civilian infrastructure enters the target list, the entire nature of a conflict starts to shift. What was once a war fought largely between militaries now begins to reach into the daily lives of people who never signed up to be part of it. Once that line gets crossed, history shows it becomes incredibly difficult to draw it back into place. This is the part of the story that worries people who've studied regional conflicts for a long time. Wars that stay confined to military targets tend to have clearer paths towards some kind of resolution eventually. Wars that start touching water supplies, electricity, and fuel access tend to spiral in ways that are much harder to control and much harder to predict. While this was unfolding in the Gulf, 3 completely separate developments were quietly taking shape elsewhere, and each one adds another layer to the bigger picture, even if it doesn't look connected at first glance. In Ukraine, the country's defense minister was removed from office this week. This was the same official widely credited as the mastermind behind Ukraine's drone warfare strategy, an approach that had helped isolate Crimea and, in a single week earlier this year, contributed to the sinking of roughly 90 vessels in the Sea of Azov. Reports suggest the removal came down to friction with a senior general rather than any failure in strategy itself. The decision hasn't gone over well. Protests followed, with plenty of people voicing support for the official who was pushed out. For a country in the middle of an active war, this kind of internal division raises real questions about stability at exactly the moment when unity matters most. At the same time, a completely different story surfaced involving China. Reports suggest Chinese actors accessed roughly 220 million voter files connected to the 2020 election cycle and beyond. In response, the current administration has pushed forward new efforts to secure voter data and advance legislation aimed at protecting election integrity going forward. China has denied all of these allegations. And a third story ties much more directly back to the war unfolding in the Middle East. Chinese firms with documented links to the People's Liberation Army have reportedly been marketing detailed geospatial intelligence, essentially precise information on U.S. force positioning across the region. Separately, a U.S. government commission focused on economic and security matters has confirmed that China's satellite navigation system has been used to help enable Iranian strikes throughout this conflict. On their own, each of these stories might seem completely disconnected from the bridges, tankers, and blockades unfolding in the Gulf, but put them side by side, and a wider pattern starts to emerge. A major regional power making decisions under internal strain, data and intelligence concerns raising fresh questions about outside interference, and a foreign nation quietly providing tools that may be actively assisting one side of an ongoing war. None of these stories exist in a vacuum. They're pieces of a much larger and far more complicated board, one where the strikes happening inside Iran are just one visible layer sitting on top of a much deeper set of global tensions. We're getting into the part of this story that ties everything together, so if you're finding value in this, go ahead and share this video with one person who's been trying to make sense of this war too. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it costs you 10 seconds. What connects every piece of this puzzle is one uncomfortable pattern. The boundaries that used to keep conflicts contained, military targets versus civilian ones, regional disputes versus global ones, one country's fight versus everyone else's business, are getting harder to see with each passing day. The strike on Kuwait's water infrastructure might end up being remembered as a small, isolated incident that faded from the headlines within a week. Or it might be remembered as the exact moment this war stopped being about ports and bridges and started becoming something much bigger and far harder to contain. Behind every strike, every blockade, and every missile launch, there's usually a goal sitting underneath the surface. And when it comes to Iran, that goal might not be exactly what's being said publicly. Analysts tracking the situation closely believe Iran's real objective isn't temporary leverage. It's long-term, permanent control over the Strait of Hormuz, one of the single most important waterways on the entire planet. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply moves through the narrow stretch of water every single day. If Iran managed to secure lasting influence over that strait, it wouldn't just be gaining territory. It would be gaining leverage over every country on Earth that depends on oil moving through that passage. Leverage worth trillions of dollars, backed by the constant threat of missiles and patrol boats stationed along the coast. According to many observers, this is what earlier diplomatic efforts in this conflict were actually about underneath the surface. Not simply ending the fighting, but locking in a version of peace that left Iran holding on to that leverage permanently, quietly, without anyone officially calling it a win. Seen through that lens, recent events start to make a lot more sense than they did at first glance. When the IRGC broke an earlier ceasefire by attacking commercial vessels, it may not have been a mistake or a miscalculation at all. Some analysts view it as a deliberate test, a simple but important question aimed straight at Washington. Would the United States actually respond with force, or would it quietly look the other way to protect a fragile diplomatic arrangement that everyone knew was hanging by a thread? Based on everything that's followed since then, the answer looks pretty clear. The response has been direct, it's been repeated, and it has increasingly focused on the exact infrastructure that keeps Iran's military machine running day to day. Bridges connecting the coast to the interior have come down. A major port control tower has been hit multiple times, 3 separate strikes and counting. A large oil tanker was disabled before it could even reach its destination. And a full naval blockade remains actively enforced around Iranian ports right now as you're watching this. Each of these actions, taken completely on its own, might look like a single tactical decision made in the moment. But stacked together, they form something much larger. A sustained, deliberate campaign aimed at limiting Iran's ability to move weapons, fuel, and revenue, all without a single American soldier ever setting foot on Iranian soil. For the people responsible for defending this strategy publicly, the message has stayed remarkably consistent throughout. Protecting international waterways, preventing one country from single-handedly controlling a resource the entire global economy depends on. Framing this entire campaign not as aggression, but as a defense of open trade routes that have existed for decades, routes the whole world quietly relies on without ever thinking twice about it. Whether that framing actually holds up depends heavily on what happens next, and right now, nobody can say that with certainty. Iran's economy is already under mounting pressure from multiple directions at once. Oil exports, its single most critical source of revenue, are being disrupted right at the source, not somewhere downstream where it's easier to absorb. Supply routes that used to move freely without a second thought are now blocked or completely destroyed. Reports suggest Iran's missile production and launch capacity may already be slowing down, with only a small number of missiles able to be fired each day now, compared to what was possible earlier in this conflict. At the same time, the recent strike on civilian infrastructure in Kuwait proves this conflict hasn't settled into any kind of stable, predictable pattern. If anything, it has become less predictable with every passing week. Military targets and civilian infrastructure are no longer clearly separated the way they once were at the start of this war, and that blur is exactly what makes the coming weeks so difficult to forecast. This raises a genuinely difficult question for anyone trying to make sense of where all this is heading. Pressure campaigns like this one are specifically designed to force a decision out of the other side. Either the targeted country changes its behavior, or it escalates even further to prove it refuses to be forced into submission. So far, Iran's public position hasn't shifted publicly, but its actual capacity to keep fighting this way may be shrinking with every single night that passes. For the rest of the world, watching all of this unfold from a distance, the stakes go far beyond this one region alone. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just a strategic asset that matters to Iran, it's a critical artery for the entire global economy. Any long-term disruption there reaches oil prices, shipping routes, and energy security for countries that have absolutely nothing to do with this conflict directly. Countries that will still feel it at the gas pump and in their grocery bills, whether they understand why or not. That's exactly what makes the coming weeks so important to watch closely. Will this pressure campaign actually succeed in forcing some kind of shift in Iran's approach, opening a real path toward resolution? Or will continued strikes on infrastructure, combined with Iran's own retaliatory strikes on civilian targets, push this conflict into a phase that becomes even harder to contain than it already is right now? There's no clear answer to that yet. Nobody watching this closely, not analysts, not officials, not journalists on the ground, can tell you for certain how this ends. What is clear is that the decisions being made right now on both sides in the span of just a few nights will likely shape how this entire situation unfolds for months and quite possibly for years to come. Somewhere tonight, a bridge that used to carry families to work, kids to school, and trucks full of everyday supplies is sitting in pieces. Somewhere tonight, a tanker that was supposed to reach its destination is sitting disabled in open water instead. And somewhere tonight, in a small nation far from the front lines of this war, people are waking up wondering if their water is still safe to drink. That's the real cost, hiding underneath every headline, every statistic, and every strategic explanation you'll hear about this conflict. Wars are rarely won or lost in a single dramatic moment. They're decided quietly, bridge by bridge, ship by ship, until one side simply cannot move anymore. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. When a war stops being about weapons and starts being about roads, water, and the ability to simply move from one place to another, has it already become something the world can no longer afford to look away from? Let us know what you think in the comments below. We genuinely read every one of them. And if you want to stay ahead of this story instead of catching up to it later, make sure you're subscribed, because this is far from finished, and we'll be right here breaking it down the moment the next move happens.